Welcome to First Reading, the Old Testament lectionary podcast for lovers of the Hebrew Bible around the world. Today we have a party episode with all four hosts.
Yeah.
Yay.
What are we celebrating again?
Epiphany
Just being
5.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, we're still in Epiphany. That's a celebration. Hey, it's just always a celebration whenever we're with you, dear listeners.
Oh.
I'm Dr. Tim McNinch from Christian Theological Seminary.
And I'm Rachel Wren, Assistant Professor of Biblical Studies at Trinity Lutheran Seminary at Capital University.
And I'm Paul Esser. I'm a PhD student in Hebrew Bible at Yale University.
And I'm Rosie Canethel, a teaching fellow for the Louisville Institute at Columbia Theological Seminary in Georgia. And folks, we are coming to you, as Tim said, on this fifth Sunday of Epiphany for our party episode. And our first reading is taken from Isaiah chapter 40, verses 21 through 31. But you might also hear a little bit about our other readings, which this week include Psalm chapter 147 and 1 Corinthians 9 and Mark 1. So, folks, where do we want to head? I think most of us have thought about Isaiah 40, but where do you want to go with this?
What do you make of this being an Epiphany text? Like, how does this fit into the liturgical moment, to use Rosie's phrase?
I'm so glad you asked him. Yes, because I did think about this, right? So we've been talking about year B and the Davidic covenant and prophetic text that will be kind of running through throughout year B as they are paired with Mark, our gospel for year B. And as Tim just told us, we are, yes, in the kind of at the end of Epiphany. Next week, we're heading into Transfiguration. And then, if you can believe it, Lent, Holy Week, Easter. So, yeah, you got to soak in Epiphany here because next week we're going to Transfiguration. So as you think about what Isaiah 40 offers us in this last week as the church meditates on the revelation of God with us, the Emmanuel, I wonder if we can maybe think about that as we talk about Isaiah 40. What does Isaiah 40 offer us in this last week of Epiphany?
Yeah, in some ways, I think this text is like the perfect last week of Epiphany text because it's, Epiphany in Greek, epiphanes means like appearance, revelation, and this moment, this historical moment of Isaiah 40 is a huge revelation for the people of God in the change, the massive change that's about to happen in their political and just regular lives.
So we're jumping in the middle of this chapter, right? But this is part of the prophecy that begins back in verse 1, right?
Right. Yeah.
Exactly,
So we're in, of course, we're in that moment, friends, if you're new listeners, Isaiah is one massive book, but scholars think that it is mostly divided up into three different chunks. You've got the early chunk in 1st Isaiah, Isaiah 1 through 39. That's the 8th century prophet who was prophesying right around when Assyria was about to come and lay the smackdown on everybody. And then here, Isaiah 40 is almost a couple hundred years later, and it's a completely different scenario. The people of God in Judah, the remaining kind of little bastion of God's people, have been destroyed not by the Assyrians, but by the Babylonians. They took everybody into exile, well, most everybody, except the poor people who were left to tend the vineyards. And they just sat for 50 years wondering, what happened to our God? What happened to the promises? What is life like now that the temple is destroyed? And that was where God was. It's not just a place. It's not just like our church buildings. Like, that was where God was on earth. So at this moment in Isaiah 40, the people have spent 50 years, almost an entire generation, sitting and wondering, what is life now in light of exile?
And I guess this is why the beginning of Isaiah 40, the words of comfort, like comfort, all my people. This is why it becomes very instructional because, this is such a very low moment in Israel's history. And to hear those words, words of hope, rekindling belief in God and trust that something new is about to happen. It's really, really inspiring, I guess.
Yeah.
I was a little disappointed to turn the page and see that we were in Isaiah again. I get a little burnt out on Isaiah, to be honest. It comes up so often in the lectionary. But then you start reading this, and there is something inspirational here, right? It just, even in English, it comes through. Just it's a kind of soaring poetry. And it strikes me with the the tone of it. What do you all make of how it jumps off the page in terms of its attitude or tone?
I guess for me, the frequent use of rhetorical questions to sort of evoke new thoughts, right? Have you not heard? Do you not know from the beginning? Like, who can be compared to our God? It's like all these lists of rhetorical questions to sort of get the people of Israel to think about the mighty works in the hand of God, who is able to do this new thing that he's sort of nudging them towards. That's a fascinating way of telling.
Yeah, anybody reading through this is going to see all of those questions really pop off the page, and they're there in Hebrew,
right.
even stronger in the Hebrew.
Even stronger, right.
Yeah. But that's not the only thing that questions can do, right? Rachel, you've done some work with question words.
Yeah, well, and so that's, that's where I really got hooked in this is because my work, of course, has been in anger in the Bible. And one of the markers of anger in dialogue is questions, like barrages of questions. And I had never read this text that way. And coming to it, I was like, geez, is God mad? And who is God mad at? And what's going on? So that led me, spoiler alert, I don't think God is necessarily mad in this moment because there's other markers of anger that are missing. But the questions, like you said, Tim, especially in the Hebrew, are just incessant. They are just over and over and over again. So that led me back to really follow up that question, like, why is God asking questions over and over again? Who is God talking to? And I think looking back at the literary context of this text really, for me, helped me unlock it. Like, what is the key to this text? As Paul said, you start back at the comfort ye my people. It starts with this very tender, gentle, moment, and that's God speaking to the people, of course, but also speaking to the prophet. And the voice cries out, every valley shall be lifted up, every mountain and hill made low, the glory of the Lord shall be revealed. And right at that moment, God sort of turns to the prophet and invites them into this majesty, into this soaring moment. A voice says, cry out. And I said, what shall I cry? The prophet at this moment is the one who is, forgive me, friends, but pissed. Are you kidding me, God? You want to talk about glory and mountains and valleys? People are grass. And you know what happens to grass, God? Well, when you breathe on it, it burns up and withers away. So what do you want me to cry in that? It's a response of despair. It's interesting that I think what this sort of moment highlights is the fact that sometimes when you're in the midst of a really hard time and the sort of salvation to that hard time comes along, you can kind of look at it and be like, so what? Show me your best. Seriously, I've been here suffering this long and now you want to tell me comfort? Prove it. So first of all, I just love that sort of audacity of the prophet to be like, prove it, God. Seriously, you're telling me mountains and valleys are going to be made low? Let's talk about that. Show me. And I think God is inviting the prophet to say, preach the good news to the people. And the prophet's only response is, what good news could be left in light of the exile?
And then that string of rhetorical questions erupts, right?
Right.
Yep. Just in talking about it right now, it reminds me so much of the end of Job.
Yeah. Yes,
right?
exactly.
There's this God, you need to show up and say something about all of this. And then God, okay, I will question you. Were you there when? Do you know this? Do you know that? And similar themes too, right? The presence of God as the creator, the one who contains and holds and supports everything in creation. That's what's laid out here, right? As a inspiration to hope.
Yeah, and I think even slightly, this one in Isaiah is even more tender, I think is the word I would use, than the one in Job. The lists of questions in Job are just like divine shouting almost, or divine ranting. These move. So I kind of tracked them, and starting in verse 12, they start with who questions, and those who questions, the response to them is all, well, God, who has measured the waters? Well, God. To whom will you would liken God? Well, no one. And then there's a shift in verse 21, which is where our pericope begins, which is the have you not known, have you not heard, has it not been told you, have you not understood? And it brings the focus and the attention directly back on the people. And not only the people, but their knowledge. And then it answers it. Have you not known? He is the one who sits above the earth. He is the one who brings rulers to naught. To whom will you compare me? And then these little moments of kind of beauty. in verse 26, because he is great in strength, mighty in power, not one is missing. So instead of Job, where it's just like, everybody sit down and shut up, I'm going to tell you who's in charge. It's, I'm going to tell you who's in charge, and then I'm going to show you how I gather even the littlest and the least of those, that my massive might is for the purpose of those who are faint and who are weary. So do not be afraid.
There's something really interesting about the way the list of rhetorical questions are functioning here, the kind of knowledge that's drawing the attention of the people onto, right? It's, first of all, the relationship between God and the natural world. It's like, it's God who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like the grasshoppers, and he stretches out the heavens like a curtain, and it goes on and on. And I guess the question that I'm asking myself is, how would these people know that God is able to do these mighty things? And I guess the thing that is drawing the attention to is observe the world and see the way the world order goes, and it is through that you come to the knowledge that God is able to bring you this mighty thing, right? It's really
So you're making me think of when Tim asked that first question, what is a whole bunch of questions, like how do they work? To me, I was thinking of a direct examination in a courtroom, right? I mean, so you're trying to draw out evidence. You're saying, do you not know?
Nice.
And so when I hear the words that the prophet is saying too, who shall you compare me to? I think of the Song of the Sea. This is what Miriam and Moses also say. There's
Mi kamocha.
Yeah, exactly. Mi kamocha, right? So who is like me? So even in the question is the answer, right? Because you can hear the echo of the Exodus, right? And so the like kind of larger evidentiary argument that the prophet is trying to make is like, this is the God of creation. Do you not think that the God of creation also holds all history in God's hands? And so what has happened to you is no accident. God has seen, and God has a purpose in all of this. So to me, this opening address of 2nd Isaiah it's a shot across the brow. Like, you have not even begun to understand your circumstance, and that you remain chosen. It's an incredible kind of, I mean, this is the reason why 2nd Isaiah is drawn upon for praise songs in the church throughout time, right? So, I mean, just the rhetoric sings.
I love that, Rosie. I remember one time we did an episode with Ethan Schwartz, and he said when the word nasa, to test, is used of God, it's a bad thing, like when humans are testing God. But especially in the Pentateuch, when God is testing the people, what he's doing is trying to give them an experience, an embodied experience that leads to trust. And I think, when you were talking about those barrage of questions, how they're drawing out evidence, it's almost like God is giving that experience to the people of an embodied trust and kind of walking them through it. This is how you trust me. When you're in a moment of despair, it takes a lot to trust again. It takes a lot to hope again. And it's almost like God's saying, this is how you do it. Come along. This is how you do it.
Which I think is one of the ways that this string of rhetorical questions helps that, because the power of the rhetorical questions is that all of this knowledge that inspires hope is not inaccessible. Yeah. If you were to stop and reflect on this for a moment, you could understand this too. Don't you know this? It's there for you to understand. Have you not heard? It's there for you to hear. The prophet's saying hope is actually, if you think about it, low-hanging fruit here.
Yeah.
That's
Right. And I love the fact that this text is not it's not Disney-fied. Like it says that God is saying, yes, there is good news in light of the exile. The good news is new life. But new life is not easy, and the Divine One knows that. There will be times where you do faint and you are weary, and yet I created everything. And so in those moments, I have the power to sustain you.
The sort of tension between being in despair or experiencing despair, and on the other hand, an invitation to hoping again, though, is a very difficult place to be, especially if you've been in despair for a very long time. So to be fair to the Israelites and the people in despair, it's like, this is a really hard space to be in. And to be like, I mean, just trying to be really transparent with myself here, I probably will find it hard to see hope by observing the orders of the world and, reflecting on the way things go. And I think, they were probably doing something as human as possible.
I think it's valuable, too, that you're acknowledging how hard it is, like when you've come through something difficult. So for preachers who are thinking about how to preach hope, it's valuable to see that the prophet instructs us in some ways by acknowledging pain. You've paid double for your sins. Like you've gone through it, and the world has seen it. And yet there's a message to be heard here. So, I mean, the value is that the preacher doesn't give up. The prophet doesn't give up. And neither does God, right? So that's the other thing is like we in our waiting, there's a mutual sort of, well, what's next then, you know? So even with as Rachel kind of pointed out, you know, people are like grass, and yet grass blooms again, right? So within each season, right? So to me, I think even in the prophet's reminder is that it's a very fragile thing, but it comes back over and over again. There's a persistence to grass.
Nice.
I was reflecting a little bit on the way that the prophet turns to creation as a way to bring about this hope or to inspire this hope. And I just happened coincidentally last night to have been watching a webinar. It was like a book release party for a new book called Asian Feminist Biblical Interpretation, edited by Maggie Lowe, just out hot off the presses, right? And they were talking for a little while in there about one of the chapters written by Lily Fetelsana Apura on the Genesis creation stories. And I'm looking forward to reading that, but the approach that Lily takes there is identifying that in Genesis, in the creation stories, there are both traditionally masculine and feminine characteristics in God as creator. And that caused me to reflect a little bit on my own sort of knee-jerk response to creation imagery as reinforcing kind of traditionally masculine characteristics of power, dominance, control, whereas there's also an emphasis in drawing upon creation and evocation of God as caretaker of creation. And as I read through Isaiah 40 again, I felt like actually it was those aspects of God as creator that seem to be emphasized here, that God cares for all of this, provides for all of this, and therefore will provide for you and care for you as well, even though you've been through the ringer. So that idea of God as creator, as caretaker, seemed to be really strong here and gets to that question that is asked near the end of our text. Verse 27, why do you say, my way is hidden from the Lord and my right is disregarded by God? No, God is able and ready to care for you just as God cares for all of creation.
I think that's a great point, especially because I think it draws attention to the building momentum of this text. You know, it starts small and moves bigger and bigger and bigger so that at the end of it, you're expecting the apex, the climax. And the apex turns out that God will renew the strength of those who are weary. Like God's biggest, most massive act of creation is a caretaking one.
So let's talk about the end there. I know we all have some things to say about this waiting, hoping thing near the end there.
Yeah, so for me, this verb in Hebrew stuck out to me because I didn't recognize it at first. It's a hollow verb. It's got a vav in the middle, so kavah, for wait.
This is verse 31,
Verse 31.
Right? Those who wait on the Lord, those who hope in the Lord. Yeah.
And I kind of sat with that because I was like, what does this word mean? And so I looked it up and I looked at the root. And what I saw in Brown Driver Briggs is that kavah, like the root means bind together by twisting, which I thought was really an interesting way for me to think about waiting, that it was not a kind of a passive, which is the way I think of when I think of it in English, like it's just sort of a waiting. I don't do anything. I just sort of wait. But in the Hebrew, it's a call active participle here. And it's those who are not only just trusting, waiting, but binding together. So I've been kind of sitting with this idea of that it's a group, a community. And that even in the way the verb is constructed is that there's a sense of we are together in this. We are bound in our waiting. And that there is something we're doing. It's not a passive verb here. It's almost like we're binding ourselves to the evidence that the questions elicited. We're binding ourselves to this truth. And that's what waiting is.
Oh, it brings tears to my eyes.
I just found it so beautiful, too. Like,
That's gorgeous.
Because, I'm kind of going through it myself. I'm preparing for my dissertation defense, and I feel kind of like, where is God in all of this? I feel kind of abandoned. And as sitting in this verse and then looking at the gospel and also thinking about this, Mark 1 passage, which is, it starts out with Jesus is healing Simon Peter's mother-in-law. And because of that healing, the whole countryside sort of shows up. But the gospel pericope doesn't end there. It then continues with Jesus goes off, so everyone's looking for him, including Simon and his friends. And they're like, where are you? Everyone's looking for you. And Jesus says, we've got to move on from here. He's in this deserted place. But the verb, if you look in the NRSV, it's translated as hunted him. And I'm like, what is this Greek verb? I look it up and I'm like, it's dioko, which is a verb that means to pursue, to make someone run. To try to literally, I mean, the NRSV does a good job of choosing the word hunt. It should stand out in a way. So in the law, if you use this word in that context, it's translated as prosecute or pursue an argument. And I'm like, this is the way that they're looking for Jesus. They're hunting him. And to me, when I put that verb in conversation with kava, in the call, an active participle here, I think about, like, is this the way that we wait on God? That there's a kind of a pursuit, a tracking down, a relentless kind of like, we need you. Everyone's looking for you. Like, I'm looking for you. Where have you been?
I would think that probably the closest biblical Hebrew word to that sense is probably darash.
To search for,
which is kind of active seeking. Yeah, and there are places I happened to see as I was researching this that darash and this kava are in parallel in poetry. So I think you're right onto something there, Rosie, with the sense of this kind of waiting is an active, at least edge of the seat waiting. It's a expectant, pursuing waiting.
Well, and one of the reasons that I teared up, Rosie, when you said that is because you made the statement, there's this binding, tightening at its core. And in my mind, I went to because waiting is a really tense time and it's really hard. Yeah. And then you jumped completely over that and you were like, and so it's being bound to something. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's such good news. And how neat would it be that, it's not just those who wait for the Lord, but those who bind themselves to the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. And of course, this is plural. And it's not you. It's not him, her. It's they. So it's that communal piece that you were talking about too. It's just so beautiful.
Yeah, the way the word is inflected in the text is koye. So that's a plural participle. That's right. So it's not just the representative one who waits. It's those together, a community who waits on the Lord will renew their strength. And if I can say one more thing about this verb, because it is really fascinating, right? So you mentioned, Rosie, that it's a participle form. And I love Hebrew participles. They're sort of my jam.
They're all over this text. They're all over it.
Yes. And this participle is in construct with the name of God. So this is using the participle as almost like a noun in construct. So these are waiters or hopers of Adonai.
Yes.
Right? So there's more here than a kind of do this action, get this outcome sort of equation. I think even in the way that the phrase is constructed, it's an invitation to take on that kind of hope or trust as a sort of residual identity, right? A defining characteristic of this community. Yeah. Adonai's hopers will renew their strength, right? Nice. Which sounds a little odd in English, but I think that's exactly what's happening in the Hebrew. We do that in English a lot, like reflecting on the New Testament, like what if they kept talking about those who follow Jesus would be awesome. We just say followers or those that disciple themselves, rather than disciples. Students, right? We don't talk about our students as just those people who study. It's a defining characteristic of that community in that context. And so I think even the hopers hasn't really made it into colloquial English. Yeah. That's the invitation here, to be a hoper community.
Oof. Well, and I think a hoper community. I know, I love that. And I think, again, just looking at the larger context, up until this point, if I'm not mistaken, the subject of the participles has almost exclusively been God. God is the one who, God is the one who, God is the one who sits above the earth, brings the rulers to naught, blows upon them like they're nothing. Those are all participles. And then here at the very end, again at that apex, it switches. And now the people are the participles, the ones who, the identity. So it's almost like the entire chapter builds to rebuild that identity. And then at the very end, it sort of hands it over. This is who you are. You are a hoper of the Lord who renews their strength, who mounts up with wings like eagles, who runs and will not be weary, who walks and will not faint.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking about the verb waiting again. The only thing I wrote here in my notes is like hope 2.0. It's like next level hoping, right? This is the way you guys describe it, and go deep into the Hebrew is all like really beautiful. But I also wrote here that this kind of waiting involves uncertainty. What pleases God about this kind of hoping process is the commitment that it involves. It requires you to be sort of committed to the process in a certain way, which is beyond just an expectation by knowledge, but it is tied in a way that is truly embodied and confirmed.
Yeah.
It's continued hope.
Yeah, taking on that identity, owning it.
And note that God doesn't just ask for it. God's not just like, here's what I want you to do this. God creates this whole scenario, sort of embodies the people into this hope, and then says, take up the mantle and run with it. It's not a demanding God. It's an equipping, a caretaking, nurturing God.
Like, it's even much more beautiful and interesting, if we think of it in light of the three different things that follows in 31, which is like the wings of the eagle and running without being weary and walking without being tired. Like, if we can do things that would naturally get us tired without being tired because of God's strength, like how beautiful would that be? This is, I guess, tied into the entire migratory journey, right?
Exactly.
They walking and they running.
Because that's what they're doing. They're being called to return to the homeland, and that's going to involve a heck of a long walk. So, that's the finale. The finale isn't that you're going to fly like an eagle. The fact is you will walk and you will not faint. That's the miracle.
Wow, and boy, could preachers take that towards the metaphorical journey of life, of faith, and of the support that we receive from God through the weariness. Well, we should probably turn towards pitfalls and angles.
I mean, I want to offer the concept of God giving power to the faint and strength to the powerless, which shows up again in verse 29 of Isaiah 40. And I think, throughout all of prophetic literature, we see the same concept of God being on the side of the faint and the side of the vulnerable and so on and so forth. And for me, that sort of idea gives both a warning to those in power, but also, an encouraging word to those who don't have power. And for those in power, it's like, God is coming after you, right? God is, there's something about the way you use power that you should watch, because God may not be pleased with that. And for those of you who don't have power, God is on your side, right? God is working to give you power and to give you strength and to give you life, because God is on your side. And I think there's something about that relationship that preachers can consider offering as a preaching point or a preaching angle.
I think the pitfall that I always want to warn preachers away from when they talk about hope and waiting is one that we've highlighted here, is that this is not easy for people that have gone through things. And to acknowledge pain goes a long way. To say that to actually acknowledge that you're going through a hard time. I think that goes a long way, and that's what the prophet does here. And I think also, if you even look at the gospel, like Jesus does heal before then going out to preach, right? So there's a demonstration of God's care, God's caretaking, that it isn't just about a command to hope, but a recognition that people are struggling. And I'm just looking at the time of the year. February 4th is when people often just kind of confront the fact that their New Year's resolutions are not coming true. Whatever it was that you had set is kind of like, okay, I've fallen down maybe. And when we think about the liturgy that's coming forward, like Transfiguration, and then we're heading right into Lent, that's a long period of time for the church to then be kind of wading through another difficult time, walking with Jesus toward passion and crucifixion. So in some sense, if you're thinking about the kind of larger picture, I'd warn away from just kind of giving a light idea of like the kind of easy praise and worship song, which is like, if you just trust in the Lord, you're going to get that strength, That's what I want to pitfall and warn away from, is like, that just seems to me like a really empty way of looking at both, the Isaiah 40 passage and the gospel passage, which, the Markan community was under persecution. There's a reason why there are two endings to Mark. So just kind of, right? Yeah, exactly. Right. To just kind of keep that in mind, that it ends with fear and amazement, and they don't really know what's going on at the end of Mark.
Maybe I would just add to that. I was also struck by the pitfall of an oversimplified pie in the sky sort of hope.
Yeah.
And that's not the flavor of the hope. As we've talked about, that's not really what's going on here in Isaiah 40. The other sort of danger around preaching about hope is that, especially for those of us who have wealth and privilege and safety in the world, preaching hope, it's tempting to make that an excuse to close our eyes to the suffering around us, couching it as, hope. Yeah. That doesn't do anybody any good, right? The hope that's talked about in this passage is meant as a resource for those who are themselves facing those challenges and are prone to suspect that God has turned away from them. This passage wants to say, no, God has not turned away from you. There is good news here. There is hope. And it recognizes the reality of the weariness and the suffering and the struggle.
Yeah.
And that hope comes in the midst of that. So it's not a denial of struggle and of suffering. And especially for those of us who walk through the world with sort of power and privilege and safety, we need to keep our eyes open to that reality and not use hope as an excuse to turn our backs on those who need us.
Yeah.
So for those who are in the middle of the struggle, the hope that's talked about in this passage is a kind of expectation that can motivate those with needs to actually voice their needs. Not a sort of quietist, just be quiet and bear it, but voice your needs, take up the space that you deserve, expect this kind of resource from God, that God will come through for you. And so sometimes with passages like this, I preach sort of two sides of the application, or preaching to two different audiences in the congregation, or asking folks to consider the text in two different spheres of their lives. So I might say, like, where you are in need, these texts affirm that the one who cares for all of creation has you in mind and is working to restore you. So have hope, have trust. Take on that identity as the hoping community, the hopers of Adonai, right? And on the flip side, where you have plenty, follow the model of God here as a caretaker and actually enter into partnership with God in the care of creation, right? Both in caring for the needs of our fellow humanity, and also I think there's a hint here of an invitation to care for the non-human creation as well, if we're partnering with God in the creator identity that's brought to the surface here. So those are a couple angles I would take. What about you, Rachel?
Yeah, the thing that popped out to me as I dealt with the questions, the historical context and the literary context, was this idea that new life is hard, which is kind of a simplistic way to say it. But, the people have been in such despair. And I think what this passage lifts up is that sometimes despair can be overwhelming. And what this passage offers is almost a barrage of hope, that sometimes it takes a barrage of hope to overcome overwhelming despair. And not to make that simplistic, not to say, so if you're depressed, all you need is a lot of hope. Like, no. But I think just acknowledging the fact that, yes, there is good news in light of situations of exile, but new life is not easy. And yet the one who calls us into good life is the one who stretches the vast expanses of the universe. And so sometimes even when new life feels impossible, it's simplistic at times, but it's also just very simple that, nothing is impossible with God.
I'm just, really struck by the way you all describe what being hopeful actually looks like. when you are experiencing despair, right? It's not clean cut. It's messy. It's full of questioning. Like you're asking questions and you're wondering and you're doubting God and you're pushing back against God and you're questioning yourself and and that's a messy place to be in. Also, really involves the hoping process. Having hope in God does not necessarily mean that you are doing this really abstract and godly thing that pleases God in a really clean way, right? But you're actually at a place of mess yourself, right? And you're questioning so many things. And I think being able to paint that out helps, because then people don't feel left out. Like you are hoping, but you have questions. You are waiting, but you don't understand. And and you don't want to feel like my way of hoping is not like the godly biblical way, because the biblical way actually is even a messy way itself,
Yep. There's a inherent gap. Anytime you mention hope or waiting, there's a gap there that's implied, right? I think the author of Hebrews might have something to say about that. That faith isn't about having everything lined up. It's about finding hope and trust in the midst of being unsure and not seeing. And well, that seems like a great place to wrap up. Who would have thought that we would find so much richness and depth in another dip into Isaiah 40, right?
Again.
Well, folks, that's going to bring us to the end of this episode, but we'll be back next week with more tools and tips for preaching from the Hebrew Bible. First Reading is produced by the four of us, and we keep all of our back episodes in a searchable feed on our website, firstreadingpodcast.com. You can interact with us there or find us on social media. If you want to help us nudge the omniscient algorithm, write us a quick review on Apple Podcasts. And if you really want to make our day, help sponsor this work with a donation or a merch purchase, which you can find on our website. Thank you all for spending this time with us. Until next time, I'm Tim.
I'm Rachel.
I'm Paul.
And I'm Rosie. Happy preaching.